From the Birth of the Empire to the Eve of Yavin, a historical documentary essay on the Star Wars canon universe, 19 BBY to 0 BBY and 19 BBY, the galaxy did not experience a simple regime change. It experienced a civilizational pivot. One government did not merely replace another. One way of organizing political life was hollowed out, discredited, militarized, and then rebranded as inevitable. The Republic had already been weakened by emergency powers, war centralization, and fear. Then Palpatine used the alleged Jedi coup, Order 66, and the end of the Clone Wars to declare that the Republic had become the Galactic Empire. To many in the core, this looked like stability after years of attrition. To others, especially those who understood what had just happened to the Jedi and to Republican legality, it looked like the door slamming shut on a 1,000-year political order. The key fact is that both reactions were real. The Empire rose not only because it was imposed by force, but because millions of beings accepted, tolerated, or even welcomed it as the price of order. That early consent, whether sincere or frightened, is one of the most important and most uncomfortable truths about the period. The first years of the Empire were therefore defined by a paradox. Publicly, Palpatine promised peace, security, and an end to corruption. Institutionally, he did not abolish everything at once. The Senate continued to exist. Senators still spoke. The old forms of law and committee politics lingered, but real power was already shifting toward regional governors, moffs, and militarized ministries. The Senate remained useful because it reassured the public, gave worlds the illusion of representation, and bought the Empire time while its coercive architecture matured. This is one of the details many casual viewers miss. The Empire did not initially govern by open terror alone. It governed through transition, through paperwork, through administrative continuity, through letting old language and old offices survive long enough to anesthetize the shock. The real break came later, once the Emperor and Tarkin believed the Death Star could replace legitimacy with fear. Only then, shortly before Yavin, was the Senate finally dissolved. Before that point, the Empire still needed the theater of constitutional life, even as it steadily strangled the substance of it. No change better symbolizes that transition than the movement from clone troopers to stormtroopers. At the end of the Clone Wars, the clone army did not vanish. It was absorbed. The first stormtroopers were, in effect, the Republic's clones under a new ideology. But over time, the Empire filled the ranks with recruits and conscripts trained for obedience rather than bred for battlefield precision. Official sources are very clear on the direction of travel. The clone troopers became stormtroopers who enforced increasingly oppressive laws, and then their ranks were increasingly filled by non-clone recruits indoctrinated for blind loyalty. The hidden base on Darrow and the War Mantle pipeline reveal the logic. 50 clone commandos training 1,000 TK troopers was not just a tactical solution. It was a regime decision. The Empire preferred an endless, cheaper, socially integrated supply of loyal citizens to an expensive, aging army of men whose very existence reminded the galaxy that this whole system had come out of an engineered war. In one sentence, the clone army had won the Empire, but ordinary citizens would be made to carry it. That shift had human consequences that the grand political story can obscure. The clone veteran seen on Daiyu nearly a decade after the war is one of the sharpest tiny details in canon. A soldier genetically engineered for total war, aged beyond his years, reduced to begging after the Empire's replacement plan has moved on without him. That single image says as much about imperial labor policy as any manifesto. The Empire wanted people as instruments, not as citizens in a moral community. Clones were useful until they were costly. Conscripts were useful so long as they were obedient. The Old Republic had at least encouraged clone individuality through names, markings, and unit culture. The Empire favored blank armor, numbers, anonymity, and repetition. This was not merely aesthetic. It was governance through depersonalization. If the Republic's clones had been soldiers in a desperate war, the Empire's stormtroopers were meant to be a public-facing ritual of sameness. Identical helmets, identical posture, identical loyalty, identical pressure applied to civilian life. The introduction of chain codes shows the same instinct expressed through administration rather than uniforms. At the dawn of the Empire, citizens were encouraged to register for individual chain codes in exchange for new imperial credits. That detail is essential. The program was not sold first as naked repression. It was sold as participation in a new financial and civic order. Once adopted, however, chain codes tied biometric data, family history, and travel into a single state-readable identity. Moving from world to world without such identification rapidly became difficult. In practice, this meant the Empire was building a galaxy-spanning registry through a combination of incentive and dependency. Before the chain code era, mobility across the galaxy was uneven and often local, commercial, or improvised. After it, movement itself became legible to the state. That is a deep change in the everyday life of the galaxy. It is also one of the clearest early examples of imperial rule, functioning less like wartime emergency and more like modern bureaucratic autocracy. Many people think of the Empire first in terms of walkers and star destroyers. The deeper truth is that it also ruled through forms, ledgers, checkpoints, and identification systems. Once that administrative logic was in place, the economy could be redirected more efficiently toward extraction and militarization. The Empire did not inherit a peaceful economy. It inherited a war economy, and one of its quietest but most profound achievements was to make that economy permanent. Corellia's massive shipyards, once part of the Republic's wider industrial web, were exploited to build TIE fighters and star destroyers while also destroying evidence of the old separatist enemy. That is more than industrial conversion. It is historical erasure paired with rearmament. On Ryloth, the Empire sold a Dunium refinery as jobs and development while really feeding its defense buildup. On Kessel, spice and coaxium extraction continued under brutal conditions, with prisoners used as slave labor while the Empire tolerated or benefited from the system's output. The pattern repeats everywhere: public language of order, comms and productivity, underlying reality of fuel, ore, weapons, and coercion moving inward toward the core. Before these programs, many worlds could still imagine themselves as peripheral members of a flawed republic. After them, they increasingly became sources of raw inputs for a centralized machine. Gorman is one of the cleanest illustrations of how the imperial political economy worked on a prosperous world that was not initially treated as an outright enemy. Gorman's economy was built on twill made from gorlectopod fibers, a planet-wide labor system combining production and delivery across 9 provinces. Buyers and designers came there because the place was orderly, wealthy, and culturally distinct. Then the Empire increased its presence, added a Bureau of Standards office, required shipping codes, demanded loyalty oaths, ran surprise inspections in the Webberies, and built an armory in the capital. This is a vital detail for understanding the Empire. It did not always begin by bombarding a place. Sometimes it arrived as standards, inventories, codes, audits, inspections, and security infrastructure. Before that process, Gorman was a prosperous commercial society. After it, the same social fabric that made the planet successful was gradually converted into something surveilled, penetrated, and radicalized. The Empire did not just occupy planets, it occupied supply chains. The institution best suited to turning those small intrusions into a system of rule was the ISB. Officially, the Imperial Security Bureau was a shadow task force created to ensure order after the formation of the Empire and to investigate and quash the first signs of rebel activity. In practice, it became the Empire's internal nervous system. Yularen's career captures the logic perfectly. A by-the-book Republic officer who had grown frustrated with Jedi independence and wartime looseness, he moved into the ISB in the belief that the Empire would restore order and fight corruption. By the time of the Death Star, he was ferreting out sedition in the Senate itself. The ISB's control center on Coruscant, with hundreds of listening stations and real-time updates, and its network of safe rooms and secure channels show what kind of state the Empire wanted to be. Preemptive, centralized, and always listening. The regime did not trust dissent to reveal itself openly. It built institutions designed to detect, isolate, and suffocate it while it was still embryonic. What made the ISB especially effective was not merely power, but philosophy. The Bureau's guiding assumption was that disorder was never accidental. Suspicion was therefore not an emergency measure, but a permanent governing principle. Ferrix, Gorman, and the Senate all show variations of the same method. Identify anomalies, centralize intelligence, transform ordinary local life into a field of potential sedition, and respond harshly enough that entire populations internalize caution. After Aldhani, for example, the Empire's answer was not simply to hunt the robbers, it was to broaden punitive authority and make examples. That approach helps explain why even imperial civilians and local functionaries often behaved nervously and ritualistically. The Empire was producing fear downward as well as outward. A state built this way is not merely police-heavy. It is epistemologically paranoid. It experiences the galaxy as a problem of hidden enemies, which means ordinary politics, labor unrest, cultural pride, or local pride are all vulnerable to reclassification as proto-rebellion. Running alongside the ISB was the Empire's quieter war against memory, religion, and alternate sources of loyalty. Order 66 did not only kill Jedi, it shattered the most visible institutional counterweight to state power. The Inquisitorius and its headquarters on Nur were the continuation of that war by other means. From the Fortress Inquisitorius, the regime hunted survivors, interrogated captives, and built databases on those who had eluded the original Purge. Purge troopers then supported that secret war as specialized soldiers most citizens never even knew existed. This matters because the Empire's anti-Jedi policy was not only revenge, it was statecraft. The Jedi had represented an older moral vocabulary, one that could call power to account in a language beyond law or decree. Palpatine did not merely want them dead. He wanted them forgotten, hidden, reduced to rumor. Before 19 BBY, the Jedi were a known if contested part of galactic public life. By the years just before Yavin, many ordinary beings treated them as myth. That is one of the Empire's greatest cultural victories. And yet, if the Empire could erase, it could not fully replace. One of the reasons the period from 19 BBY to 0 BBY is so rich is that future power players begin in forms easy to overlook. Saw Gerrera starts as a veteran of the Clone Wars and an anti-separatist insurgent on Andor, then becomes one of the first people to recognize that the Empire is simply the war wearing a new uniform. He remains charismatic, effective, and increasingly extreme. Cassian Andor begins not as a banner-waving idealist, but as a survivor shaped by theft, prison, and arbitrary power, then slowly becomes one of the Alliance's most capable intelligence officers. Luthen Rael, hidden as an antiquities dealer, becomes a secret architect of the early rebellion, willing to trade morality for momentum. These are not just character arcs, they are political arguments. The rebellion that eventually confronts the Empire is not born as a clean organization. It is born through smugglers, militants, compromised aristocrats, spy masters, radicals, and people who decide that legality has become another word for submission. The senatorial wing of that story is just as important. Mon Mothma and Bail Organa did not start as open revolutionaries. They began as politicians trying to restrain Palpatine through Republican means, then as covert organizers, then finally as public founders of an alliance. Official canon is explicit that their secret resistance work begins in the final months of the Republic. After the rise of the Empire, Mothma remains in the Senate while secretly working with Organa, Velsartha, Luthen, and other operatives to unite disparate factions. Bail quietly identifies allies, guides Leia into both the Senate and the Hidden Rebellion, and maintains a loyalist face while financing resistance behind it. Before this senatorial opposition, rebel activity existed in cells, movements, and local insurgencies. After these politicians begin to act in concert, rebellion gains something more durable. Channels, trust, money, legitimacy, and eventually a language of restoration rather than mere revenge. This is a crucial shift. Without it, the anti-imperial struggle may have remained fragmented and local. With it, it begins to imagine itself as a government in waiting. The underworld, meanwhile, was not separate from this history. It was one of the environments in which imperial inequality and social abandonment were most visible. Han Solo and Qi'ra emerge from the exploited underclass of Corellia, a world of massive shipyards, white worm control, and industrial desperation. Han tries the imperial route upward by entering the academy, only to be chewed up and dumped into the mud of Mimban. Qi'ra rises through criminal hierarchy into Crimson Dawn. Both trajectories matter because they reveal the limited social mobility of the Empire's order. Ambitious poor people could be fed into the army, crime, or labor, but rarely into freedom. Kessel similarly sits at the junction of crime and state, a slave labor extraction world ruled by the Pikes but tied into the wider imperial economy through spice and coaxium. These are not peripheral details. They show that the Empire's proclaimed rule of law coexisted comfortably with coercive labor, tolerated syndicates, and whole populations treated as expendable inputs. If one wants to understand how the Empire reshaped the galaxy visually and psychologically, the starships tell the story as clearly as the laws. The Venator-class Star Destroyer belonged to the Republic's military emergency, versatile, transitional, tied to the Clone Wars. After the fall of the Republic, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer took that legacy and transformed it into doctrine. Official sources say plainly that Imperial Star Destroyers became symbols of the New Order on planet after planet. They were not just warships, they were visible sovereignty. Their wedge silhouettes, their tie complements, their capacity to launch troops and probes, and their sheer presence in orbit announced that a world was now subject to a regime that preferred intimidation before negotiation. TIE fighters extended that message downward into atmosphere and sky. Fast, cheap, intimidating, and deliberately unforgiving to pilots, they mirrored the broader Empire itself. Efficient enough, expendable by design, and built to normalize fear. Before the Empire, fleets could still be read as contingencies of war. After it, starships became civic architecture. That same ship language appears on the other side in embryonic form. Hera Syndulla's Ghost Crew helped transform rebel activity from localized sabotage into something that could ferry people, information, and legitimacy across sectors. Hera helped broker alliances, establish chopper base, and escort Mon Mothma to the space over Dantooine, where Mothma's call drew rebel cells together. Luthen's Fondor Hallcraft represents the opposite but equally important end of the spectrum. A civilian-looking vessel modified for clandestine survival, covert movement, and intelligence work. The rebel fleet of the original trilogy did not spring fully formed from nowhere. It was assembled out of this earlier ecology of couriers, cells, converted freighters, partisan contacts, and captains who knew how to live without a state. Before the Rebel Alliance, there was a transport web of trust. The ships mattered because they carried not just troops but political possibility. By the Middle Imperial years, the Empire was not only policing worlds, it was attempting to engineer what kind of future the galaxy would have. Some of this was public. Academies trained cadets into ruthless service and promised advancement, especially to young humans on marginal worlds. Standardized stormtrooper recruitment and local garrisons made service look like order, purpose, and escape. Other parts were secret. Project Warmantle on Darrow accelerated the replacement of clones with conscripted TK troopers. The Inquisitorius hunted Jedi survivors out of sight. The ISB watched for ideological drift. And beneath all of that, Krennic and the Yatarkan Initiative pushed the Empire's ultimate answer to dissent. A battle station so overwhelming that politics itself could be short-circuited. Publicly, the Empire still sold careers, law, and development. Secretly, it was preparing a world in which fear would no longer need to persuade, because it could simply annihilate. The Andor years, roughly 5 years before Rogue One, are where all these trends become legible at once. Aldhani shows an occupied world where culture, terrain, and sacred custom have been subordinated to garrison logic. The payroll heist there matters not only because it funds rebellion, but because it reveals the Empire's financial bloodstream, salaries, military accounts, and logistical confidence. Ferrix shows what happens when ordinary working people, salvage networks, and local grief collide with surveillance and arrogance. Gorman shows the next stage after that. The Empire does not only occupy, it manufactures radicalization by entering a peaceful, prosperous society with armories, codes, oaths, and inspections until civic dignity itself becomes combustible. Mon Mothma's databank entry now makes explicit that after Gorman, she goes public, names the massacre an imperial genocide, and becomes a public enemy. In other words, by the late imperial period, the Empire is no longer merely generating scattered opposition. It is actively fusing local grievances into a common anti-imperial narrative. This is where the ISB's philosophy finally fails on its own terms. It was built to detect, isolate, and suppress the first hints of insurrection. But that method depends on rebellion remaining local, deniable, and structurally weak. Once every crackdown teaches new populations the same lesson, the system begins creating the coordination it fears. Luthen understands this before most others do. So does Saw, albeit in a harsher and more morally corrosive way. Mon understands it politically. Cassian learns it bodily through prison and loss. The Empire's mistake is to assume that fear always atomizes. Often it does. But when fear becomes universal enough, it can also standardize resistance. This is one of the deepest continuities from 19 BBY to 0 BBY. The Empire wins countless tactical confrontations, but strategically, it keeps teaching different people the same reason to oppose it. The formal birth of the Rebel Alliance at Dantooine is therefore not the sudden beginning of rebellion, but the consolidation of work that had been going on for years. Official sources trace the Alliance's origins back to Clone Wars resistance units like the Andor rebels, and to clandestine senatorial meetings in the late Republic. Dantooine matters because it turns that long prehistory into declared coalition. Mon Mothma resigns from the Senate, calls rebel cells together, and more ships answer. That is the decisive before and after. Before Dantooine, the anti-imperial galaxy is a patchwork of partisans, cells, smugglers, senators, and militias. After Dantooine, it has a name, an idea of restored democracy, and eventually high command. It is still militarily outmatched, but it is no longer politically inarticulate. That is why the Alliance becomes so dangerous. It is not just armed opposition, it is a competing claim to legitimate government. Power players who will matter far beyond this era are now clearly visible. Thrawn enters the Imperial system as the rare commander who studies culture as strategy and treats Lothal and Ryloth as intellectual as well as military battlefields. His use of factories, testing programs, and intimidation to squeeze production and punish failure reveals an empire trying to perfect itself technologically, even as its politics rot. Tarkin, by contrast, embodies the philosophy that fear can replace civic legitimacy. Krennic embodies the engineer bureaucrat who wants to win power through secret weapons and proximity to the throne. Leia, guided by Bail, is already being prepared to inherit both public office and covert struggle. Cassian is becoming the kind of intelligence operative the Alliance will need once rhetoric gives way to harder war. Hera is becoming the connective tissue between cells and fleets. Han Solo, meanwhile, is still in the background of this larger political story, but his Imperial training, Mimban trauma, criminal education, and eventual turn toward the rebellion are already preparing one of the future heroes of Yavin. The era is full of beginnings that do not yet look decisive because the future has not announced them. All of that leads inevitably to Project Stardust and the Death Star. The battle station was the Empire's greatest public secret and its deepest strategic confession. For nearly 2 decades, the state invested in a weapon meant not merely to destroy enemies, but to make politics obsolete. Official material describes scientists on Eadu, led by Galen Erso, working to fuse kyber shards into structures capable of amplifying energy into a stable planet-killing beam. Krennic, as Director of Advanced Weapons Research, made the project his life. Tarkin saw it as the instrument that would end descent through terror. Jedda's kyber and Eadu's laboratories thus become more than plot settings. They are the places where the Empire converts science, mineral wealth, and long bureaucratic secrecy into a machine designed to abolish bargaining itself. Before the Death Star, the Empire still had to combine force with law, governors, and surveillance. After the Death Star becomes operational, Palpatine is ready to dissolve the Senate because he believes terror alone can carry the burden of rule. Rogue One is therefore not just the prelude to A New Hope. It is the collision point of everything the previous 19 years have built. Saw's extremism, Cassian's hardening, Mon Mothma's caution, Bail's hidden commitment, Krennic's obsession, Tarkin's doctrine, Galen's sabotage, and the Alliance's still fragile command structure all meet around one question. Can the plans be taken before the new form of Imperial rule becomes permanent? Scarif shows that by 0 BBY, the rebellion is still divided on method, but no longer on the scale of the threat. When Jyn Erso and Cassian's team go to Scarif, they are acting in a world where formal committees have begun to fail the pace of events. Admiral Raddus's decision to support the mission anyway is one of the pivotal leadership moments of the age. The plans are beamed upward, copied, and hidden in R2-D2's memory. A humble astromech becomes the courier for the most strategically important technical document in the galaxy. This too is one of those deep Star Wars details people overlook. Empires concentrate power upward, but their defeats often travel sideways, improvised through ordinary hardware and courageous theft. And so the period ends, not with settled war, but with acceleration. The Senate is gone. Alderaan still exists, but is hours away from annihilation. The Death Star is fully active. Star Destroyers and TIE Fighters stand ready to enforce a post-political Imperial order. The Tantive 4 is carrying the plans toward Tatooine and toward Obi-Wan Kenobi. Leia Organa has become the bridge between the old senatorial resistance and the open rebellion. Cassian and Jyn are dead, but they have changed the terms of history. The rebellion that began in worried senatorial meetings, exploited labor systems, occupied worlds, underground town halls, radical cells, and stolen payrolls has now become something that can strike directly at the Empire's central instrument of fear. That is where the galaxy stands just before A New Hope begins. Not yet liberated, not yet even balanced, but no longer trapped inside the Empire's preferred story about inevitability. Between 19 BBY and 0 BBY, the Empire transformed the galaxy by centralizing identity, militarizing labor, converting industry into armament, replacing clones with ideological soldiers, and teaching entire populations to live under surveillance. But in doing so, it also created the conditions for a rival political imagination to survive long enough to become an alliance. The greatest deep truth of this era is that the Empire's real failure was not simply cruelty. It was overconfidence in the durability of a system that kept manufacturing its own enemies.